Oh, and we had talked about this a little bit, the idea of cloud commodity. It is cloud a commodity, and then where does it go in terms of exchanges? But I think the neat thing is you have come up with a model for actual cloud pricing, right, where you actually can do apples to apples pricing. Let's talk about that a little bit as we talk about the idea of exchanges.
Yeah, so it's, I suppose it is an apples to apples comparison in some sense. Um, the problem with tracking the cost of virtual machines and storage is that in reality an application will probably use a variety of different cloud services. So to analyze the change in cloud pricing based purely on virtual machines and storage is unrepresentative of the real situation.
Mhm.
So inflation, so when governments assess inflation, they have the same problem. How do they judge how the price of things are changing? So they pick up a basket of goods. So these are the typical things a consumer would buy from the grocers every week. And by measuring how these groceries change in price every week, the national banks and governments can track how inflation is changing. So we've just launched a cloud price index, which is essentially a similar measure to inflation, but for the cloud market. And in our basket of goods, we have the typical specification of a web application, which includes storage bandwidth, virtual machines, different types of database, DNS services, support, all of these typical things that an enterprise might want in a standard application. And we're going to go to cloud providers every few months whenever price cutting takes place, and we'll ask them to requote our basket of goods. And in that sense, we'll be able to measure how the real price of cloud is changing over time. And in our first incarnation of this, we found out that our application was $2.56 an hour. And that would include everything you need to run quite a powerful web application.
That's pounds, that's dollars.
That's dollars, that's dollars.
Okay.
Is it Canadian, Australian, or American?
US dollars,
All right.
US. But we'll see how this changes over time. So Google announced some price cuts a couple of weeks ago, and their price cuts brought the index down maybe 3 or 4 cents. And I was expecting Amazon actually to reduce prices at reInvent a couple of weeks ago, but they didn't. So we'll have to keep watching the industry to see what will happen in cloud pricing and to see who will cut prices next and how that will affect the index.
Right.
Yeah, that's you get into some fun economics there, but ultimately what you're trying to deal with is information, asynchronous information, right? The cloud providers know a lot more about pricing than the buyers do, right? Amazon knows what the average price is across all of their clients, but no client has the way to understand what other people are paying and what their discount levels are. This is actually an emerging problem in the enterprise, is that there are large enterprises, tens of billions of dollars large enterprises that are saying, well, I want a discount because I'm this big, right? Well, how do you assess the discount? Because there's an information asymmetry. So the cloud pricing index is a way to do that. And that's part of the reason that you're going to see the movement to exchanges. And we can talk about commoditization. You got 2 economists on the phone. We'll talk about this all day. But part of what you'll see with that movement is centralized price discovery, and that alone will create a level of transparency that will address a lot of the cloud cost issue.
Deirdre, what's your take on is cloud a commodity, or is it headed that way? And if so, are the cloud exchanges going to play a serious role in terms of how cloud is priced?
Yeah, I mean, I think based on what we're seeing today in the market, it's not a commodity. There's aspects of cloud services that are commoditizable, so storage and VMs. But I think because all service providers are providing slightly different mix, or as Owen said, the basket of goods is slightly different. So there isn't a standard across all of the providers, and therefore that causes confusion, and to the advantage of some of the main providers, because they can differentiate and adjust their prices and get into this price war that we see today. The reason Owen needs to keep on top of his cloud price index is because it is constantly changing. So there is an element of price wars going on, and I think until there's some standardization, and then commoditization will follow thereafter. So it's it's also advantageous for some of the behemoth strategic players because they have critical mass. So, like Rob was saying, they have an advantage where they actually fully understand, they know how they're going to make money, and they fully understand what their costs are. And, as they scale and grow, they have a bigger advantage over the smaller regional geographic players. So, across Europe, it's made up of thousands of distinct, geographic specific players because of data sovereignty, which is a key critical element that we don't face every day in the Americas. But I think there's commoditization will come, but it's a ways off. I think we're a couple of years away from seeing any commoditization, and it will be very specific units that will be commoditized.
Yeah, it's certainly the consumer price index, the U.S. government CPI is famously inaccurate because the basket of goods is only somewhat representative of what real people buy. So I'd be curious to see how the cloud price index shapes up over time in terms of the cost of cloud versus how the CPI cloud price index actually tracks that. Oh, and we'll be watching, in other words.
So
definitely. And I wonder if there's, I think maybe as time goes on, we'll look at other applications and other locations as well. So I am keen to emphasize that the cloud price index is a benchmark to measure how relative changes are happening rather than an absolute measure.
Right.
And just back to Deirdre's point, I completely agree. I think virtual machines and storage, yes, I think they are approaching a commodity state, but there are some differences in region and in other features. But cloud providers are so much more than just these basic quantities. It's all the other services they sell that add the differentiation.
Yeah.
And it'll be interesting as well to see how the cloud price index changes in terms of what's in the basket.
Right.
Because looking at all the announcements the different cloud providers make in terms of new features, I'm sure we'll have to reassess what a typical application is over the next 1, 5, 10, 25 years.
Right.
Well, and this is where I would argue that cloud is absolutely a commodity. The question is, how do you define cloud? And this is to the point that the others do. So if you look at there are two leading cloud exchanges, and I won't dwell on them a whole lot, but part of the reason that they're driving in this particular direction is to say that there are elements of this industry that are absolutely commoditized. If I build a 1 gig of RAM, 1 CPU, 4 gig of RAM machine, put Ubuntu Linux on it, attach it to the internet, you couldn't tell the difference, right? And by definition, that makes a commodity. So the question becomes, how do you define the commodity classes? So there will be a commodity class. There is a commodity class called infrastructure as a service. And if you define that as running a free Linux distribution and with an internet connection and with no SLA, right? That is a commodity, right?
But the infrastructure as a service providers might argue with you and say, hey, but my service is different from that other infrastructure service provider. Sure. Yeah.
And tomato soup from different vendors tastes different, but it's still tomato soup.
Yeah.
This is my point. But then you subdivide that class called infrastructure as a service into geographic regions: U.S. West, U.S. East, right? UK, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Asia Pac. And then you subdivide that into, say, there's web scale infrastructure as a service with no SLA, and then there's enterprise grade infrastructure as a service with SLAs. And then within enterprise grade, you're going to have a regulated and a non-regulated class. So when you think about commodities, it's not just commodity, right? Tomatoes are a commodity. Okay, if you make ketchup, you don't care what kind of tomatoes. But if you make pasta sauce, you want Roma tomatoes. But those are also a commodity, but they are a subclass of the commodity called tomato. So yes, cloud is infrastructure as a service is, storage as a service is, or can be treated as a commodity. And that's why you see Amazon and Google and Microsoft racing to the value-added services, because the infrastructure as a service and the storage as a service is effectively the gateway drug, right? That's what gets you into the cloud, right. And then from there you migrate to the database services and to the DNS hosting services and the messaging services and the queuing services that are non-commoditized, and that's where they're going to drive their higher margins.
So Rob, are you saying that you basically have the raw materials, or the commoditized elements of the raw materials, but you still need to put them all together to make an actual viable, valuable business service?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a difference between the commodity raw material inputs. Infrastructure as a service is a commodity raw material input, right? Infrastructure as a service is not a web app.
Mhm.
Right? You can use infrastructure as a service to build a web app, absolutely.
Right.
And that's the trick. When you talk about the commodities and is cloud a commodity, well, yes, elements of it absolutely are. Does that mean people will consume it as a commodity? Yes, in part. But they're going to couple that with on-premise. They're going to couple that with code. They're going to couple that with value-added services and bundle those to create valuable business services. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Right? But if you think about today, where this gets really interesting, one of these large banks in New York or insurance companies are spending hundreds of millions or billions of dollars on infrastructure, just physical servers. And that's a 7-year commitment, minimum. If you can treat that as a commodity and hedge that risk in an exchange, then all of a sudden you've taken a multi-billion-dollar asset that's going to depreciate faster than GAAP and move that off balance sheet. And what that means is that your company can now focus on the value-add aspects of creating that valuable business service. Not to get too far into the theory of that. As I say, you put two economists on the phone after.